Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. My name is Janine Walsh. I'm Communications Coordinator for the Franciscan Action Network, and we welcome you to Creation Care, What and Why. You may notice that as you came into the room tonight, we have muted all of our participants, and we are expecting a very large crowd tonight. So this is in order to reduce background noise. We are going to have a Q&A, a question and answer period toward the end of the event. And we're going to ask you to please enter your questions on the chat function, which is down at the bottom of your screen in the center. We will be monitoring that all night. And just finally, I wanted to let you know that we are recording this event for those who can't make it, so that we will be able to distribute it later and we can post it to Facebook and our YouTube channel as well. And with that, we're going to get started, and I am going to throw it to Sister Maria Orlandini, who is our Director of Advocacy, and she is going to begin us with prayer. Take it away.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Before praying together, let us spend a few moments of silence, remembering in particular all the species that will be extinct this month. Creator of all, we are grateful that from your communion of love, you created our planet to be a home for all. By your holy wisdom, you made the earth to bring forth a diversity of living beings that filled the soil, water, and air. Each creature praises you in their being and cares for one another from our place in the web of life. Open our hearts to participate with your Holy Spirit to renew the face of our earth and safeguard a home for all. Amen. And now Sister Louise will take it from here.
Good evening, and welcome to the Franciscan Action Network presentation on Creation Care, What and Why. I'm Sister Louise Lears, and it's my privilege to serve as the Director of Creation Care Advocacy for the Franciscan Action Network. And we address these issues around care for creation in the context of the season of creation, an annual Christian celebration of prayer and action, which began on September 1st and concludes on October 4th, the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, patron saint of ecology. And certainly the extreme weather and natural disasters of recent months reveal afresh to us with great force and at great human cost that creation care is an urgent matter of survival. And tonight, we're privileged to listen to and interact with two excellent speakers, Professor William Dingus of the Catholic University of America and Cassandra Carmichael of the National Religious Partnership for the Environment. They will help us to reflect on our obligation as people of faith to pray and act on behalf of our common home. So we thank you, Bill and Cassandra, for offering to share your expertise and your reflections with us. And Professor Dingus is going to lead us off after I offer a short introduction for him. So William D. Dingus is the Professor of Religious Studies in the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the Catholic University of America. He received his PhD in American Studies in 1983 from the University of Kansas. And he's been on the faculty of Catholic University for 39 years. Bill began teaching a course on religion and ecology at Catholic University over 32 years ago, and he remains active in various lay Catholic and interfaith organizational initiatives to forward care for creation agenda. He is a certified Montgomery County master composter and a passionate lifelong gardener. I have to say, Bill, I knew there were master gardeners. I did not realize there were master composters.
There are. I'm pro-rut.
So Bill will offer us a faith-filled reflection on the what and why of adjusting care for creation. Bill.
Thank you kindly. So welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be here and to be with you this evening, and I want to thank you for your presence. And I'm happy to share a few thoughts with you about the what and why of creation care. I also want to make a special thanks to, or say a special thanks to my friend and at least one-time university colleague, Steve Schneck, who asked me to share a few reflections with you. I want you to know that I'm just coming off an hour-and-a-half class, and in which I've had a mask on, and I am so happy to be able to speak without my glasses fogging over or something of that sort. So I'm going to be fairly direct here. There are two things. First of all, I'm making two assumptions with regard to what I'm going to share with you. The first is that I'm assuming that all of us recognize in one fashion or the other that the environmental crisis that is upon us, that this is not only, an important issue, it is a critical issue. This is a literal matter of planetary life and death. This beautiful planet, blue planet, has a scathing fever. Ecocide and sacrilege, environmental sacrilege, are in full throttle. The climate window is closing. And as the UN Secretary Antonio Guterres said of this recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, we are in a code red for humanity. And I would just accentuate that this is a code red for all life systems, not just human beings. So as Catholics, certainly we should be aware that Pope Francis has been repeatedly insistent about the urgency of the situation in which humanity, in which all planetary life systems currently find themselves, that we need to recognize the urgency, we need to act now, and we need to act decisively. There is an environmental, like the old, doomsday atomic clock, there is an environmental clock ticking here. So that's my first assumption, that most of you share with me the urgency of what we are dealing with. My second assumption is that I'm probably, if you will, going to be preaching to the converted, in the sense that I suspect I'm not going to be telling many of you things that you aren't already aware of, or that you haven't heard before. So I'm going to offer some comments about why people of faith, and including Franciscans, should feel a moral responsibility to address climate change. And if all I'm telling you is stuff that you already know or are at least aware of, then simply take my remarks as a kind of affirmation or word of encouragement to you for your own convictions and how you see things. I wanted to basically, the way this is titled, to talk about the what of creation care and then the why of creation care. And I'm going to flip this a bit, and given the time constraint here, I'm going to talk about the why of creation care first, and then if there's any time left, I'll have some remarks to say about the what of creation care. So I'm going to reverse the order of the title here. So this question about why, this is something I often try to provoke students with, the two most important questions you'll hear in your life is who cares and so what? That is to say, why ought we be concerned about what's happening? And all of us recognize, of course, that there are an endless number of pragmatic and purely utilitarian reasons to be concerned about what's happening to the environment. And most of these reasons, these utilitarian pragmatic reasons, are of course self-serving or have to do with our own self-interest. So, I don't want pollution to get bad because I might get sick, or I don't want to see sea levels rise because the value of my ocean property will decline. And by the way, I don't have ocean property. Or if the Pacific Ocean becomes a quagmire of floating plastics, I won't be able to, enjoy my boating pleasures and things of this sort. These are purely pragmatic utilitarian reasons. And this is something that Pope Francis in Lodottosi categorically repudiates. That is to say that we think only in relationship to the environmental crisis along utilitarian pragmatic lines of thinking, if you will. And I would say here that I'm boo-hooing this utilitarian thought. I don't take this as being entirely bad or negative, and I would argue that it's necessary. I mean, there's a lot of research that's been done on how people's attitudes can be influenced in regard to the environment and so forth. And these pragmatic utilitarian incentivizers, we should not entirely discount them. It's just simply common sense knowledge, and research shows us that you can achieve a certain amount of change in people with regard to playing on their own sense of self-interest. So I'm not totally discounting the merit of that, but I'm going to focus on what this has to do, or why we should be concerned in terms of issues of faith, religion, morality, spirituality, and so forth. This is my focus. So I'm going to make 7 points, or I want to make 7 arguments, if you will, or assertions about why people of faith and why we as Catholics in particular, or Franciscans more specifically, why we should be concerned about the environment. So here are my 7 points, or here are the 7 things that I want to say. The first is that this environmental crisis is at heart fundamentally a moral, spiritual crisis. It is not simply a technical, public policy, or scientific problem. Yes, obviously, it has all of those elements to it, but at its heart, it is fundamentally a crisis or it raises fundamental moral, spiritual, religious questions, if you will. These have to do with, why are we here? What responsibilities do we have? How do we live a just life? How do we live harmoniously? How do we live in a sustainable way on a finite planet? Who has sovereignty over creation? What does it mean if we acknowledge, or we're willing to acknowledge, that nature has an integrity in and of itself, independent of any relationship with the human person? So we recognize that, and also too, if we recognize that care for creation, that this is, if you will, a Christian virtue. If it's a Christian virtue, then it necessarily involves issues of morality. So my point here simply is that, to begin with, we are facing a fundamental spiritual crisis, if you will, not simply, again, a scientific or public policy crisis and so forth. My second point is that with regard to caring for creation, for Catholics, this is something that's deeply rooted in this moral principle of the respect for life. And this is something that I think some of us feel we have had a somewhat kind of narrow sense of what respect for life means. And I would like to draw your attention, if you are not already aware of this, to a more expansive notion of what respect for life means. And this is something, this is an imperative that was made explicit by Pope St. John Paul II in one of, in my mind, the two most important magisterial documents dealing with the environment. And that is his January 1990 World Day of Peace message, Peace with God the Creator, Peace with all of creation, in which he says, and I am quoting him, this comes near the end of the document, and this is what he says. At the conclusion of this message, I should like to address directly my brothers and sisters in the Catholic Church in order to remind them of their serious obligation to care for all of creation. Then he says, respect for life and the dignity of the human person extends also to the rest of creation, which is called to join man in praising God. Again, that last sentence, respect for life and for the dignity of the human person extends also to the rest of creation, which is called to join man in praising God. So this is something, this basic principle of respect for life is something that has obvious implications in relationship to that extend beyond the human person. The third reason why we should care about creation and being called for creation, to care for creation, has to do with the fact that we are literally being called to do so. Vocare, to be called forth. And you ask, who's doing the calling here? And notice calling implies somebody on the other end, that's doing this. So, we could start as Catholics with the Second Vatican Council, particularly with the, in Gaudium Spes, the idea or the imperative to, quote, heed the signs of the times. That is to say, as the Church has come to embrace the world, if you will, there is the imperative in that process of embracing it to heed the signs of the times. There are moments when I wonder, of nature, imagining how brutal does it have to get before humans start to realize or to read the signs of the times. Now, how are we being called? We're being called on many fronts. We're being called by nature itself. It should be obvious to all of us that nature, if you will, is trying to tell us something, and we need to listen. We need to pay attention. We cannot continue to act as though we're atomistic individuals living in environmental isolation. We have got to pay attention to what nature is telling us. We're also being called by the scientific communities. Again, you may be aware that in 1990, a group of scientists, including a number of Nobel Prize winners, produced a common letter to the faith communities, inviting them to join the scientific community, both sharing, from a religious point of view and from a scientific point of view, this sense of awe and reverence in relationship to nature. We're also obviously called by Scripture. The scriptural text, the biblical text, is loaded, and particularly, in the book of Genesis, there is a very rich theological anthropology there that has all kinds of implications in regard to the environment and our relationship to and with it. We are also, again, as Roman Catholics, we are being called by the Church's magisterium, and the two most, again, documents in this regard, in my mind, are, as I mentioned before, John Paul II's Peace with God the Creator, Peace with all creation. That particular document really lays out the basic arguments about why the environmental crisis, why this is a moral crisis, why nature has its own integrity, what the earth means as a common heritage, the need for, particularly those of us that are middle, slightly upper middle, to challenge our lifestyles, and to respect the harmony and order in nature. And the Lodottosi, which is the other obvious, highly important document in terms of our being called. Really, Laudato Si, I mean, Pope Francis brings his own particular kind of third world perspective to the issue, but he also reiterates many of the same points that are made by Pope St. John Paul II in this Peace with God, the Creator. Also too, I would mention that, as you probably know, there are virtually all national Episcopal conferences have produced statements on the environment, calling Catholics to be responsible. I mean, I think going back, I believe it was in the 80s, the bishops of the Philippines, what's happening to our beautiful land. There is no doubt in relationship to the magisterium, how we are being called to respond. The fourth reason, as I run out of time here, trying to hit 7. The fourth reason has to do with issues of justice. This is probably the easiest one that most people get, that obviously the environmental crisis does not fall equitably, if you will. There are some who suffer much more than others. We have this very unjust situation in which, generally speaking, those who are the least responsible for the situation in which we find ourselves are the ones who are most adversely affected by it. And this is what's important about Laudato Si. I mean, if you ask yourself, okay, so Laudato Si reiterates many earlier points that were made about the environment. What does Pope Francis do to really pushes things forward? And the way he pushes things forward is by highlighting this notion of integral ecology. We do not have there's a social problem over here, and then there's an environmental problem over there, and they don't have anything to do with each other. No, they are inextricably bound together. This is the fundamental ideal or idea behind this notion of integral ecology. This also too folds into Catholic notions of the preferential option for the poor. That is to say, if it is the poor, the disinherited, those who are canceled, if you will, in terms of their lives and the dominant culture of political and economic power, that we have a special obligation to them. And they are the ones, again, who are affected most directly and most severely by the environmental crisis. This is also something, by the way, that, as we all know, this COVID tsunami has made clear, the inequities. The fifth reason has to do, this more relates directly to Franciscans, and that is that, John Paul II made St. Francis the, quote, heavenly patron of those of us who are trying to promote environmental or ecological issues. Francis, in my mind, his vocation, his life, his charisma is one that affords us a model, obviously, of a virtuous way of being in a proper or right relationship, not only with one another, but also with nature and the environment. And one of the most important things that he did, in my mind, in regard to ecology, the environment, was to get us, or to help us start thinking in terms of kinship. That is to say, and particularly in relationship to other kind or animals, if you will. St. Francis used a vocabulary of kinship. And this has, in my mind, profound spiritual and psychological consequences if we take this seriously. The sixth reason that we should care for creation has to do with the fact that we as Catholics have so much to offer. I mean, I am of a mind that Catholicism, theologically speaking, there are ways in which we are deeply implicated in the crisis that we're facing. But we also have so much to offer in terms of ameliorating that crisis. This sacramental sensibility, which heightens our sense of reverence towards the created order. Catholicism offers a theology of worldly affirmation, the goodness of things, this notion of the common good, which is so fundamental to Catholic social teachings. I mean, you talk about a basic ecological principle, the common good, the universal destiny of goods, the call for environmental justice. I mean, we really have so much to offer, and we need to preach that and to say that and to get that out there. And then finally, I guess my final reason is we should be concerned about creation and creation care because we should be concerned about creation care. That is to say, as people of faith and followers of Christ, we do believe that we are created in the image and likeness of the one who is the origin of all that is created. We are here for a purpose. Our lives have meaning. We each have gifts and talents that we can offer to this hurting world. And these gifts and talents include a capacity for wisdom and practicing virtue. And we need to act on these. We need to do the right thing. In conclusion, be concerned. Because the environmental crisis is a moral crisis. Secondly, we have a respect for life ethic that's expansive. Thirdly, we are called by many voices, including our own magisterium. Fourthly, Catholic social teachings has much to offer, particularly with regard to the poor and the disinherited, with regard to integral ecology. Fifth, that St. Francis provides us with a credible model, if you will. Sixthly, Catholicism has much to offer practically and spiritually. And finally, this is the right thing to do. Amen. Thank you.
Amen, Bill. Thank you. Thank you especially for reminding us that, yes, we are deeply implicated in this spiritual moral crisis. And yet, we have so much to offer. And we must do that. Oh, thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Wonderful reminder. So now, we have the pleasure of hearing from Cassandra Carmichael. And Cassandra is the Executive Director of the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, where she works to carry out their mission. I'm going to quote the mission here. She did. To encourage people of faith to weave values and programs of care for God's creation throughout the entire fabric of religious life. Cassandra previously worked the National Council of Churches USA at the Washington office, and she has served on the White House Faith-Based and Neighborhood Advocacy Advisory Council Task Force on Climate and the Environment, a really long title, and it's such an important group though. So Cassandra is going to address the environmental provisions and faith perspectives of some of the current infrastructure legislation that is finding its way through Congress. Cassandra.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Great to be here and happy to share what I know. And I really appreciated Bill's words. And in particular, I think what I took away most from that is our voice and our ministry is really important as we become compelled to act on these things. It's really important, if we're going to do creation care, that we need to bring our voice to the forefront. And that's just not our voice within our own walls of community, but our voice in the public sphere, and in particular with government, because we can't do it alone. We can't do it alone just in our communities. We can't do it just alone at the local level. We have to have partners in our work, and that's partners both at the global level and partners at the state and local level and partners at the national level. So I've been charged with briefly going over what's going on in the Hill. It's both dramatic and boring at the same time, and wonky and interesting also. It's a very dichotomous world. But if you've been reading the news, there are two pieces of legislation that are miraculously, potentially going to be voted on and perhaps passed. And one is a bipartisan infrastructure bill. In that bill, there are provisions to have some clean energy provisions, you know, the typical roads and bridges building provisions. There's some provisions in there for working on plugging orphan wells related to drilling, but it doesn't go very far at all in terms of addressing climate change. So then there's another piece of legislation, and that's called the reconciliation package. The bipartisan bill, it goes through sort of a regular process, and it needs to have, you know, 60 senators to help it pass and a majority of House members to pass. It's sort of sitting in the House side because the Speaker of the House has said that that piece of legislation is not going to move forward unless it moves forward in tandem with the reconciliation bill. And this reconciliation bill that I'm talking about contains a lot of what President Biden has sort of hung his hat on policy-wise. And in that reconciliation package is a very large, it's a historic climate initiative and legislation that could potentially pass. And so it has lots of things on clean and renewable energy. So shifting how we invest. It has investments in environmental justice communities. I mean, it's still being sort of written, the details, but the idea is to invest in environmental justice communities and BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, and to make sure that we're moving towards clean and renewable energy, and that there are other provisions in there to protect public lands and to use those, make sure that we're utilizing public lands, which are God's creation, to be able to heal the climate and to heal creation. And there's also, again, things that go further than the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was, that should be voted on as well. So that's sort of a quick and dirty, no anti-pun intended, but a quick and dirty overview of sort of what that package is about. It includes other sort of non-environmental provisions, but there's a huge chunk in there that could really change the dynamic on climate and really move us towards a different sort of, you know, carbon neutral economy where we're not at net zero, but we're at zero emissions. Investments in clean energy, like I said, but also investments in clean transportation and transit, all the things that we would need to do to reposition ourselves and to think differently about how we relate with creation in terms of our energy use. So the process is as such, and it's a little complicated because it's a reconciliation package, not a regular piece of legislation. So the infrastructure bill that I talked about, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, moves regularly. Like I said, it needs 60 votes in the Senate, it needs a majority in the House, and then it gets signed by Biden, assuming they both say the same thing, both bills, or both, you know, each chamber says the same thing. For the reconciliation package, because it's centered on budgetary items, then it can move through a process where it only needs 51 votes in the Senate and a majority in the House. So it becomes a little bit more drawn out in terms of its process. It has to go through committees, and it has to go through 2 series of votes, one on each side. And the House always goes first. So they're pretty far along in the reconciliation process. They're probably about halfway through. So they've done the budget resolution, and now the committees are doing their work. And then the House will vote on the reconciliation package in its entirety, and then it will move to the Senate. The House is supposed to vote the week of September 27th, and the Senate is supposed to vote, since they go second, they will vote the following week, the week of October the 4th. And then it'll go back to the House just to make sure to iron out any little differences. And then it goes to President Biden's desk for signature, assuming that there are 51 senators that vote yes on it and a majority of House members. And neither one of those things is guaranteed, because if you've been paying attention to the news, Senators like Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, Senator Manchin from West Virginia, Senator Sinema from Arizona are balking a little bit. They're wanting to put a little pause on it. They're getting a little panicky at least in public, about the price tag of the reconciliation package because it's $3.5 trillion. And then there are House members that also are getting a little antsy about passing it. So there's House members in Oregon and Hawaii, other places that are, and Maine, that are not really 100% sure they're supportive of this. So it's going to be a little nip and tuck, but if it does pass, it will be an incredible step forward in addressing climate change. And it will do so in a way that isn't, it's not a cap and trade bill. I was thinking about this last night. It's much more comprehensive because it really embodies sort of more of a holistic approach, as holistic as Congress can be. But it really looks at energy, it looks at transportation, and it looks at public lands. And I don't think you can really look at one particular sector or one particular area as a climate solution. You have to look at them all. And there's also provisions in there that for environmental justice, so that we're not doing our climate work on the backs of those communities that they're not voiceless, but sometimes they aren't heard, right? And they've been marginalized, they've been put on the edges. So the goal of the reconciliation package is to lift them up and to help. So I can take any questions.
Thanks, Cassandra. And thanks for helping us to understand some really complex legislation, because as you said, it's moving through in two different ways in Congress, the two different bills. But thanks, you made that very clear, right? We do have some time for questions and comments, and Janine is going to lead us here.
Yes, thank you, Sister Louise. And we do have a couple of them. Actually, the first one is for Bill. Bill, when you were making your second point about the Respect for Life issue, someone had said you had mentioned the name of Thomas, and we didn't get exactly who you were mentioning. I don't know if you have that in your notes. Was there a Thomas? And you're muted.
I don't believe so. I don't. No? If I was using the name Thomas in relationship to speaking about environmental issues, it would be Tom Berry, of course.
Thomas Berry. Okay.
Yeah, but that wasn't who I didn't specifically mention.
Very good. Very good. Not a problem. Not a problem. Thank you. I didn't remember hearing the name Thomas either, but I said I would ask to clarify. This question is, I'd welcome answers from both of you, actually. Are there any concrete actions that we can undertake and promote right now at home in our own communities? I don't know, Bill, if you wanted to start, and then we could move to Cassandra.
Sure. I mean, I think there are multiple ways, and this is something that's really important. We have to personally witness, if you will, in terms of our quote lifestyles and so forth. So, we each need to try to do what we can to make, our own nest, if you will, as environmentally sound as you can. I mean, I have a huge garden that would scare a lot of guys my age, and we compost all of our materials. We have, energy efficient windows, siding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we all have to do that as we can. And again, this is to recognizing that some of us are in a more privileged position to do that than others. The other thing that I would also emphatically want to emphasize is that we need to get involved, politically and through various organizational kinds of initiatives. And for those of us, again, as people of faith, through religious communities, we need to, make use of, if you will, or utilize the strength in numbers that becomes a part of being part of a congregation or a parish or a community of faith. And it would be a long time talking about what's happened here in the Archdiocese of Washington over the last 40 years. We currently have a group called the Care for Creation Committee. And we have, these are lay Catholics and some Catholic priests who are very much concerned about environmental issues, have been working, initially sort of independent of one another, but have come together in a kind of common cause. We, among other things, when Archbishop Gregory came to Washington, we began working on a document that would encourage implementation of Laudato Si, a kind of an action plan, as he had helped facilitate where he was previously located. We also have a group called Maryland Catholics for Our Common Home. We've engaged in various kinds of lobbying initiatives and things of this sort. So my point here simply is that we need to do things in our own personal life, and there's a ton of information out there about how you can live more energy efficient and so forth. But we also need to be involved organizationally. We need to exercise political muscle. We need to be in the public domain as people of faith, as was said earlier, in terms of witnessing, and particularly if we're taking seriously the notion that this is fundamentally a moral problem. So get involved. And sometimes I can tell you in my own life experience here over the last 40 years, this has been a long, hard struggle, pushing a heavy rock up a steep hill. But we are at a point now in regard to religion and ecology, or religious institutions, where this has really reached critical mass. And more religious communities are, you have groups, the Interfaith Power and Light, and there are multiple interfaith groups out there that you can get connected with. So
Great.
Please do.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Cassandra, anything to follow up with? Anything specific?
I think Bill makes an excellent point, and I often think about this phrase. I agree with him 100% about we have to be a light to the world, right, as best as we can. And I want to emphasize as best as we can. There's no such thing as perfection. But I often think about the wording in the Bible where two or more are gathered in my name. There's a huge power, just a spiritual power, in coming together in community to work on something. You lift, you carry each other's water when you're tired. You hold each other accountable. You inspire each other. The places where there are two or more gathered to do this ministry are the places where there are things happening on the ground. The other thing I will say is that I noticed in the chat, Nora was asking about passing this climate legislation. If you look back, and she was asking how important this is, and this sort of gets at the earlier question. I'm hoping this isn't a once in a lifetime, but it could be once in a decade, or once in a multi-decade opportunity, because you have the power dynamics such that they are in Washington that could potentially, not guaranteed, but potentially allow for a major piece of climate legislation to make it through. And if you remember, during the Obama administration, Obama had the first 2 years of his first term to pass something big. They chose healthcare. Healthcare passed, and it was transformative. I'm sure it had some flaws and it needed fixing, but I think the folks that have been working on healthcare would say that that was a huge piece of healthcare legislation. We're now in month 8, 9 of the first term of Biden. Might be his only term, we don't know. So there's this very narrow window, and now and the piece of legislation has come forward, and now is the time for us to really push. Doesn't mean that we're not going to get other bites at the apple. It might be smaller bites legislatively, but this is a big, huge bite that we can take. And so I think now is the time. If not now, when? Like this is the moment. And this is it's pretty comprehensive. It's pretty large. It's not perfect, but it is a very unique opportunity that I'm not sure will come up again for quite some time. I could be wrong,
right?
But my name is Cassandra, so I'm gonna rest on that for a little bit.
Thanks, Cassandra. That was terrific. Thank you. Maybe we could just go into, we've had a couple of questions about how to discuss these issues with people who are global warming skeptics, what concrete examples we can give during a Sunday morning conversation with people, and also provisions about the impact of people who are most vulnerable. Bill, do you want to start with any or all of those thoughts?
Okay, I just would offer this when, dealing with or talking with, if you will, or engaging people who are clearly on a different page with regard to the environmental crisis and particulars thereof. I think there's kind of four things that I try to do or try to be sensitive about. One is to really listen. In other words, to try to really hear what it is that they're expressing, and not just on the surface, if you will, but in terms of deeper kind of either anxieties or fears or what have you. So, oftentimes we can talk to each other, but we're not necessarily listening. So the first thing is to just try to really hear what a person is saying. Second thing is that, and again, I realize there are circumstances where this becomes impossible, but the second thing would be to try to find common ground. In other words, yes, we're kind of at two different places here on this issue and so forth, but is there somewhere that we can find common ground, some kind of common agreement that, yes, we see this happening, even though we may disagree about what the cause of it is and so forth. A third thing is that, and this is something that research tends to bear out, if you can get people to see that other people like them, if you will, have changed or shifted or so forth, sometimes that can be helpful. In other words, you're not using yourself necessarily, as sort of the model, and therefore you have to be like me, but you can get them to see that others like them, have moved, if you will, on a particular issue. And then the fourth thing would be just the obvious, and that is that we have to be faithful to, in terms of how we live relative to what we say. In other words, that we witness to them by the integrity of our own lives in terms of how we live. And we bear witness, if you will. So those are four things that I kind of roll around in terms of, dealing with people that, and I have to say, I haven't, had a whole lot of those kind of negative experience, but I have had them, and I know that can be very, very frustrating sometimes.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Cassandra. Actually, somebody asked in the chat the difference between net zero and zero. If you could go into that.
Sure. So zero carbon emissions would be nothing, right? It's 100% clean. Net zero would be metaphorical equivalent to, you can mess up the kitchen. So part of the kitchen is messy and the other part is super clean. So it's sort of net clean, right? And the problem with net zero is that there are some places where there are emissions and other places where they're, maybe drawing down, right? They're super clean, capturing emissions. So it gets to net zero, but then the question from an environmental justice perspective is, where are those places where there are emissions? And we can just look at history, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know, or environmental scientists to tell us that those places are probably going to be situated in BIPOC communities of color. So that's the difference between the two. The environmental justice community and others are really advocating for zero emissions. We want the whole kitchen to be clean. It's not okay for part of us to live in a dirty kitchen and other parts get to live in a super clean kitchen. I'm just using that metaphor because it's after dinner and I have children.
Well said, well said. And I might add in, I think the dirty part of the kitchen is also going to be very probably that lower income community. Exactly. Very good. Can we speak to what we're eating maybe has an effect on the environment. The resources such as, you know, grains and water and how we can consider those when thinking about the planet. Anybody have any information on that?
Well, NRPE has actually been beginning to work on this issue, not from a advocacy standpoint, but from gathering together a collection of Christians, Christian leaders and denominations to talk through what does it mean, and what does it mean if we're looking at, you know, if we consider our food table to be a metaphorical communion, then how are we manifesting that communion? How are we manifesting the love that we've been, that's been asked of us to both feel and deliver when we sit down at the table? And that includes our relationships, not just with one another, not necessarily, you know, the other people that may or may not be sitting at the table, the farm workers, but it also calls upon us to think about our relationship with farm animals and our relationship we have with the earth, depending upon what we choose to put on our plate. And what we choose to put on our plate has profound climate impacts. It also can have, depending on how the food is, how the meat is obtained, how it's slaughtered, can have significant impacts on the health and well-being of those animals while they're alive. Not every, I learned this recently. I was thinking, oh, if we just use the climate lens, then it would make, in regards to how we eat meat, then we wouldn't eat any meat. And that's not necessarily true. I think, you know, chickens are a little bit more climate friendly than like beef, things like that. But I like to go back to it's not about being absolute. It's about relationship, and it's about an exploration of those relationships and really immersing ourselves in the wisdom and knowledge and figuring out how we can live in right relationship with God, obviously, but how can we live in right relationship with our neighbors, and also the neighbors that aren't, you know, human. And I think that can, it's more of, in my view, it's less of a definitive answer and more of an exploration of relationships, because food is so, I mean, anybody knows this, right? Like food is so emotional. So but I think it's really worth taking a look at, because it might be not just what we eat, but how, like the process by which we get that food, that can help inform our decisions. So
I love what you're saying, Cassandra, and it points actually to Bill's fifth point about St. Francis being a model for a virtuous way to be in relationship with creation. So I love that. Thank you so much. Bill, back to you. We had a question: is radical change and comprehensive spiritual transformation necessary, or do you think we should more focus on practical incremental changes? And someone also brought up intergenerational justice. Maybe you could speak to those points.
Yeah, two things. One is that I do think that had I done my 7 points about the what of the care for creation, one of those 7 points was sort of the imperative for, if you will, ecological conversion. Again, John Paul II, Pope Francis. That is to say that we need to really have, and remembering that conversion is not compliance behavior. We're talking about a radical alteration in root reality. We're talking about a U-turn in life. And in this sense, I think that our commitment to, our involvement in, our care for creation and so forth, that this really does necessitate some type of a conversion experience, particularly in a culture that is so heavily dominated by a consumeristic, materialistic, atomistic individualism. And that we have to have some kind of a conversion experience that can, if you will, radicalize us. And by radicalize, I mean something that puts us out there, that puts us to work, that, to see, to act, to judge, and to act. And to me, some dynamic of conversion is prerequisite to that. So the other thing is a really important issue, and I'm sorry that I bypassed this or I didn't mention it, when we talk about social justice in relationship to the environment, and we talk about the preferential options for the poor, we also have to remember that social justice, as it relates to the environmental crisis, this also has to do with future generations. I mean, we cannot continue this rapacious destruction of this planet. And if we do not act responsibly in this regard, nature will act brutally, and our children inherit the ruins. And this is what's happening. We're seeing each generation is inheriting a further degraded environment. This cannot go on. And this involves a fundamental issue of intergenerational justice. And for those of us that are parents and grandparents, this is a very compelling incentivizer. In terms of what are we leaving our children? I mean, what kind of fools are we? So we have to see that justice is not only environmental justice in relationship to the poor, the disinherited, and so forth, but there's also an intergenerational dynamic. And somebody posed that question. I saw that, and thank you for doing that.
Yes.
I obviously, I meant to say that.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks. I appreciate it. We also had a comment, actually, which Cassandra, I'm not sure how much you're tied into the USCCB, but given Lodottosi, the comment is, why haven't all the archdioceses fully embraced creation care to make it a more spiritual priority? Some of the conservative dioceses are constantly preaching pro-life, but yet haven't reached the understanding that creation care is also pro-life. So that begs the question, what is the latest from the USCCB on the environment? Is anything statement-wise in the works? I'm not sure if anyone has that information.
Well, they have statements on creation care and the environment. They have statements on climate change. They've issued some policy letters regarding certain climate policies. So they are working, as you know, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is not a top-down, it's a conference, right? It's a table of a multitude of bishops. And I don't know the answer to why. Maybe Bill already said the answer, right? They haven't had the conversion experience of the radical love, haven't fully embraced what I view is the message of the gospel, to be in right relationship. I'm not sure. I'm not going to pass judgment on that. I'm going to hope and pray that there is continued movement with those bishops, and that there is the aha moment that happens, that the pro-choice stance becomes womb to tomb, and not just in the womb and then we're done. And I think a lot of people are praying for that sort of insight to happen as well.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, Cassandra. Thank you. That's wonderful. This comment came through, I think, from one of our staff members. Very important, obviously, for all of us to take personal steps and to advocate in our communities with our members of Congress. What do we do about big government, big corporations, which are also big carbon emitters? Any thoughts?
We try to pressure them, if you will. We let them know that we're out here, so to speak.
Well, I mean, we could have a discussion about, like, is big better or worse? I know in certain parts of the fossil fuel, in the drilling industry, it's not the bigger players that are the problem, it's the smaller players that are not good stewards. So I think it can cut both ways. And I saw in the comments that someone asked the question about divesting in fossil fuels.
Yes.
And it seems like that there's a difference between divesting in fossil fuels and divesting in fossil fuel companies. I know that seems like it's a very nuanced approach, but I know there are some folks that believe, in the faith community, that believe that there needs to be a voice at the table at these traditional fossil fuel companies in order to shift how they do their work, and so that they then move away from fossil fuels and move into other forms of energy. So it's not necessarily they don't stay fossil fuel companies, they become energy companies, right? That's very different than divesting from fossil fuels. I know in the Arctic Refuge, there have been multiple companies that have refused to drill or provide insurance for companies that want to drill, or bankroll drilling that happens in the Arctic Refuge. And that's a way to sort of like divest. I think they're divest in that fossil fuel activity, but still have those players be part of it and have voices within those organizations like Bank of America or Travelers Insurance, have voices pushing on those companies through shareholders and through just leadership to do the right thing. So it's a little nuanced. I'm sure there's multiple answers to that question.
Absolutely. And, I also wanted to point out that our chat act function also there was a couple of different people who spoke up with their different organizations that they work in, as far as helping to start a conversation, helping to do your own thing personally in your own community. Whenever we come across, any actions, we always try to pass them along. Ours from Franciscan Action Network are typically in the vein of an advocacy. So we need to call our senators, we need to call our representatives, and demand that they act on climate change to care for all of God's creation. We also, speaking to Cassandra, what you were just talking about, we know of a very a great supporter of ours in one of our sisters communities, who works at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, which does exactly, Cassandra, I see you nodding, what you were talking about, going to the table of those big corporations and helping them, as Bill says, have that spiritual transformation and try to work their corporation better, so that it recognizes the damage to the environment and tries to correct it. So the other thing that has been brought up a couple of times in our chat is Pope Francis's 7-year Lodottosi action plan. It's officially going to be launched on St. Francis Day, October 4th this year. And a lot of religious communities and organizations are actually paying attention to this and trying to put together their own action plan about how we can move together for, again, the common good. So I think that might be close to our last question. If anybody has a final thought, Bill, you look like you're ready to say something.
Oh, no, I wasn't. Just I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts. And again, I think that it's really among the many things that people of faith can bring to the circumstance in which humanity finds itself, or all life forms, is hope. But I think it's also, we need to convey an ethos of hope, if you will. But also, I'm one of those that, hope in and of itself is not necessarily, you need a plan along with hope. So I encourage all of us to, bear witness in our personal lives, have a plan, get involved, make a difference.
And simple things, make a call to your senators. And
Absolutely. Yeah, I've gone, I really have had some eye-opening experiences in the Maryland House of Delegates with groups lobbying. And I would encourage, if you have an opportunity to do that, to do so. That can be quite revealing to hear, what the representatives have to say, and things like that do matter to them. In terms of what, where they go on an issue and so forth.
Absolutely.
It does matter.
Absolutely. One of the things we learn in Washington is whenever we go up on the Capitol Hill, we hear from the senators and representatives, what are my constituents saying? So it's very, very important to these people what their voters are saying. So absolutely. Thanks so much, both of you, Cassandra and Bill, for all of your comments and for your insight. Louise, I will throw it back to you. We might be ending just a bit early tonight.
My goodness. Well, I will catch that throw. And Bill and Cassandra, we are so grateful to you for guiding us through I'll switch it around here, Bill, the why and the what of creation care. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot to pray about, and a lot to act on, considering the choices that we all have to make. Want to thank, as we start to wind up here, the FAN staff, some of whom you see on the screen and some of whom are working hard behind the scenes. But thanks to Nora, Sister Maria, Sister Marie, Jason, Janine, and Steve for all of your work on this. And finally, thanks to everyone who participated in tonight's webinar and to all who will watch this recording in the future. As Pope Francis says, it will take all of us, whoever and wherever we are, to change our collective response to the unprecedented threat of climate change. This is a critical moment. And what better way to address a critical moment than prayer? So as we gather up all that we've heard and all that we felt, we'll ask FAN Executive Director, Dr. Stephen Schneck, to lead us in prayer. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Sister Louise. And let me, on behalf of Franciscan Action Network, also extend my special thanks to my old friend, Bill Dingus, and my new friend, Cassandra Carmichael. And also thanks to everybody for participating in, well, as Sister Louise said, this critical discussion tonight. My prayer is, I think, related to the first of the reasons that Professor Dingus mentioned this evening. It's a prayer really for our internal, our spiritual transformation, the turnaround that Bill just spoke about a few minutes ago. And it's appropriately from Pope Francis and from his wonderful and inspiring and so important encyclical Lodottosi. At the end of Lodottosi includes a couple of prayers, and this is the conclusion of one of those prayers. So let's take a moment for silence. God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love. For all the creatures of this earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live. The poor in the earth are crying out. O Lord, seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect all life, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you. Lodottosi. Amen. Thank you all.